Is it on? Yes. Good morning. The Hearing Board of the South Coast Air Quality Management District is in session. Today is Wednesday, May 29, 2019, and the time is just after 9 o'clock a.m. We are meeting in the Hearing Board room in Diamond Bar. We have one matter on calendar for today, and that is Orange County Sanitation District, case number 2048-14 for a regular variance. And who is representing Orange County Sanitation District this morning?
Maya Gross for Petitioner.
Good morning. And who is representing the executive officer?
Nancy S. Feldman for the executive officer.
Good morning. And before we take opening statements, I'm going to ask anyone who wishes to testify or be heard in today's proceeding, including any member of the public who wishes to be heard, please rise to be sworn in at this time. Please raise your right hand. Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. We have one set of documents and another document that I'd like to mark at this time. The first one is a multi-page document, 4 pages. The top document is overview of engine facility, and we're going to mark that as exhibit number 1 for Petitioner. And the other is a single-page document entitled Emission Levels Achieved, and we will mark that as exhibit number 2. And with that, Ms. Gross, you may begin your opening.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Prusak and members of the Hearing Board. We are here today to seek regular variance relief for the Orange County Sanitation District, or OCSD, in connection with equipment at its wastewater treatment plant in Huntington Beach. Specifically, we are requesting relief from the permit condition that require annual performance testing and source testing as it relates to one of their engines and its associated SCR in order to allow them sufficient time to complete a repair of this relatively new and complex equipment while at the same time meeting its obligations as a public agency to provide sewage treatment and other wastewater treatment. OCSD is a public agency that provides an essential service, wastewater treatment and recycling, to more than 2.5 million people in Orange County. As you'll hear in the testimony, in the past several years, OCSD has been a pioneer in implementing new green technology at both its Huntington Beach and Fountain Valley plants in a variety of applications, including with respect to the specific equipment at issue in today's variance request. OCSD's plants are a total of 25-year-old jet cell internal combustion engines, and they use this as the primary source of electricity and process heat in their wastewater treatment operations. The engines burn both digester gas and natural gas. They have the capability to blend from the treatment process. Several years ago, in response to the technology forcing NOx limits of Rule 1110.2, which became effective in 2012, OCSD initiated a state-of-the-art pilot program to retrofit these old engines with a sophisticated SCR system, the first and still, to our knowledge, the only one of its kind for this type of application, which is digester gas burning jet cell engines. The pilot program was conducted with the aid of a $200,000 Air District grant. The total pilot program was about $11.6 million. And it was so successful that OCSD undertook a $23.8 million capital project to retrofit all 8 of its engines at its 2 plants. The system has been enormously successful and substantially reduced not only NOx, but also CO and VOCs. However, it is a much more complex system than the previous system, and unfortunately, in August 2018, a backfire of one of the engines, engine number 3, at Plant 2 in Huntington Beach, caused substantial damage to the SCR. The engine was shut down immediately, and no excess emissions resulted, but OCSD had to do a thorough investigation to determine causes and implications of this backfire as it relates to the entire system, and has been in the process of soliciting bids for repairs. However, this process will not be complete for some time, and OCSD is requesting relief from the provision in its permit that requires an annual source test and performance test for the engine and the SCR, the deadline for which is June 7th, 2019. As you'll hear, OCSD is a complex agency that manages a fluctuating and substantial flow of projects and activities with their finite human resources and subject to their governing ordinances. The workflow involved in the repair and recommissioning of this engine and SCR, which often generally functions as standby power for them, must be balanced with OCSD's obligations to provide its essential public service. You'll hear how the complexity of repairs and the balancing of the agency's priorities affects the timing of the completion of the project. Importantly, there have been no excess emissions associated with the engine and SCR event, and there will be no excess emissions if the variance is granted during the variance period. If the variance is granted, OCSD has committed to completing the repair and source testing and coming into compliance by May 15th, 2020, which is a slight change from the petition, which stated June 7th, 2020. And today you'll hear from at least two witnesses. Rob Thompson is OCSD's general manager. He will explain the operations, the equipment, and the complexities of the repairs and the project management workflow at the agency. And Rhonda Abu-Shaban is an environmental specialist. She will testify to matters of compliance with Air District rules and permits, as well as how OCSD will achieve compliance going forward. And additionally, OCSD has here other specialists prepared to answer any questions that may fall within their areas of expertise. OCSD takes very seriously its obligations to not only comply with district rules and regulations, but also to be a pioneering agency at the intersection of wastewater and air quality, as evidenced by not only setting backed for these engines with its project and not having appeared before the hearing board in more than a decade, but also other initiatives and pioneering technologies as well. OCSD appreciates your consideration of the forthcoming testimony. Thank you.
Thank you. Before you give your opening, Ms. Feldman, we received proposed variance conditions. Are those from the district?
Yes.
Okay, we will mark those proposed variance conditions as Exhibit A, as an apple. Ms. Feldman, your opening.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Prusak, and good morning, members of the board. The district is not opposed to the granting of a regular variance here today. We understand that there was an incident with this engine which left it in disrepair and affected the attached SCR as well. Our only hesitation with this variance was in terms of the length of the variance itself, the amount of time that this petitioner proposes to come into final compliance. The petitioner has been working steadily with district engineering staff as this case has developed, and we are at the point now where we're looking forward to the testimony to substantiate the length of time, but at this point do not anticipate any opposition.
Thank you. Ms. Gross, you may present your first witness.
Thank you. I'd like to present Robert Thompson. Could you please state your name and spell it for the record?
My name is Robert Thompson, R-O-B-E-R-T, T-H-O-M-P-S-O-N.
And have you been administered the oath?
Yes.
And what is your position at OCSD?
Assistant General Manager.
Thank you for that correction. What is your background?
I am a registered professional engineer electrically, and I'm also a registered professional civil engineer. So I have a bachelor's degree in engineering from Cal Poly Pomona, master's in public administration from Cal State Long Beach, and have been working with the Sanitation District for about 24 years.
Thank you. And what are your job responsibilities currently and most recently?
I am the Assistant General Manager in charge of operations and maintenance and the engineering department. In addition, after retirement that happened earlier in the year, I'm serving as the Director of Operations and Maintenance. So a more direct connection since January of this year.
And could you please provide a brief overview for the hearing board about what OCSD does?
So OCSD is the regional wastewater provider for North Central Orange County. Again, we service 2.6 million residents. The newest number is 2.6 million, plus those that come into our county to work. And so that residents and then the industry so we service more than 2.6 million people in general. On a dry summer day, we'll treat about 185 million gallons of water at our 2 treatment plants. On a wet winter day, we've been as high as 600 million gallons. So we are the end of the pipe for the Inland Empire and Orange County. There's a lot of interconnections in the sewer systems, so whatever comes down that pipe, we are obligated to treat. In addition, we do a lot of recycling. We don't see ourselves just as a wastewater treatment plant, but we are a resource recovery facility. So to that end, we take that 185 million gallons of water on a dry day and turn 100 million gallons of that into drinking water. So we produce, in cooperation with Orange County Water District, 100 million gallons of distilled quality water, which is put into the aquifer via injection wells and 4 base systems in Anaheim, and provide that drinking water, which basically services 1 million residents with drinking water supplies in north central Orange County. As a part of our treatment process, we also collect organic compounds. Those organics we turn into energy. So we put them in anaerobic digestion systems. We create methane gas. That methane we treat, clean up, and then run through our central generation plant, which is the issue at hand today, and create about 60% of the overall power needs we have. That's electrical power, but we also use the heat that derived from those engines to heat our digestion process and heat and cool some of our buildings. So we try our best to use every ounce of that energy we can for useful purposes. What we aren't able to convert into biogas, we then create a nutrient flow to farm communities in Arizona and for composting in Southern California. So we try and return all those valuable nutrients back to the cycle for food production across Southern California. So we do a lot to try and reuse and put everything back in service we can. We have about 400 miles of pipeline that collects sewage from local agencies. There are 25 that we serve. Once it gets to one of our 2 treatment plants in Fountain Valley or Huntington Beach, we do preliminary treatment, primary treatment, secondary treatment, which is basically biological treatment, and have the ability to put the water that isn't recycled to the ocean. We have a 5-mile outfall system off Huntington Beach, so that 85 million gallons that isn't reused is discharged 5 miles out, 200 feet deep in the ocean. We have a full environmental program with the ocean to make sure the discharge is safe and having no negative impact on the ocean. So we're connected to several agencies along the way, regulating us, not only AQMD, but State Water Quality Control Board, EPA, and several others.
Thank you very much for the overview. You mentioned that it was the central power generation system that is related to the equipment that is the subject of today's variance. Can you please generally describe the engine and the emissions control equipment itself at this plant 2?
So in our Huntington Beach plant, which we call the plant number 2, there are 5 internal combustion engines. These engines have the ability to burn either natural gas or digester gas or a blend of those 2 gases. They are permitted specifically, or they were built specifically to provide a reliable power source for our water permits, which require that no matter what, we need to be able to power our treatment plant. So if there's loss of Edison power, the central generation plant kicks in and makes sure that we have an available power supply, even in wet weather, to run our treatment systems and keep sewage out of the streets. That's an important public safety, public health issue for us. It's our primary mission. At plant number 2, we have 5 3-megawatt jet cell engines. So they're not necessarily a diesel engine. They're not necessarily a regular internal combustion engine you'd have in your car. What happens is we take a pilot fuel. It has a spark plug, and so as the compression cycle comes up, as the piston's coming up, the pistons are so large, they're about 1 foot in diameter. You can't just have one spark. The spark wouldn't propagate fast enough for good combustion, so they have a jet cell system. So they have a small chamber with natural gas in it. Spark plug fires natural gas, and it shoots into the combustion chamber and propagates and makes that foot wide combustion chamber work properly. So it's a little unique. It's not a normal transportation sort of engine that you'd see. It's a stationary engine, and that jet cell technology presents some additional complication and some additional challenges in how you have your fuel management. So as we're managing the fuel flows and trying to manage digester gas with a different heat value than natural gas and make sure we have proper combustion in the chamber, stable operation, proper pressure in each firing cylinder, there's a lot of control that goes along with how that works. In addition, there's an important check valve system that goes there, which became, we think, the source of the issue. It took some time for us to figure out why we had the backfire. The backfire, we believe, is attributed to a sticky check valve system. Because our engines are a little older, they're Cooper-Bessemer engines. Cooper-Bessemer is no longer in business. They sold the rights to their engine system to the General Electric Corporation. They're now considered the original equipment manufacturer. They have updated the check valve technology, but we find that some of those check valves tend to stick, and when they stick, they allow gas to pass through the jet cell. So when you're starting or stopping the engine, as it's rolling up, before you start introducing gas, you have to get it up to speed. It was passing gas through, we believe, allowing that gas to pass through the combustion chamber unburnt into the exhaust system, and that's when the backfire occurred. The gas mixture in the exhaust system ignited, probably at the catalyst bed, and that explosion damaged the exhaust system, which is a very complex two catalyst and urea injection system.
Okay, thank you. And before we get into the details of the engine issue, could you, because it sounds like this is very related, could you describe for us what this SCR system is that's attached to the engine? And you can feel free to use what's been introduced as Petitioner's Exhibit 1, the overview of the engine facility.
So to give you a sense of scale, you can see the pictures of the engines on the overview of the engine facility. You can see the people standing in the lower right-hand corner up on the platform above the engine. So these are very large pieces of equipment. Going to the next page, you can see in the upper right-hand corner the 36-inch pipe system that is the exhaust system. So those nice, bright, shiny, insulated pipes you see going straight up and then out through a wall, those are the exhaust pipes we're talking about. Another view at Plant 2 is the bottom. So there's Plant 1 on top and Plant 2 on the bottom with the 5 engines in line. Number 3 is the engine we're talking about. Moving on to the next picture, you can see what's outside the wall. So the emission control catalyst system, you can see it's a vertically aligned system where the exhaust leaves the engine, comes through the first catalyst. I believe that's the oxidizing catalyst to reduce volatile organic compounds and CO. We then inject urea. The urea allows us to reduce NOx in the next SCR catalyst. Then it comes back into the facility and into a steam boiler. So all of that from the engine exhaust port through the catalyst, urea injection systems, back to the steam system was all new and additive to reduce the overall emissions of the engine. And it has been quite successful in reducing the emissions.
Okay. And so when, if we're looking at, for example, page 3 of the showing the emissions control, this is all new related to that project?
So in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see there's the white tank that says urea on it. Everything from that tank and cover system, all the platform additions, all that steel is new. Before the project, that was bare concrete. So all of that platform, all the piping, the catalyst systems, urea piping, control, delivery, all of that's new. That's what cost $24 million to put together.
Okay, thank you. And turning now to Exhibit 2, could you just sort of explain what we're looking at here in terms of this chart?
So the sanitation district, and working with the Air Board, was striving to meet the new NOx regulations and CO regulations. It was a very difficult process. What made the system so difficult is the gas that we're using. Digester gas has properties that can quickly contaminate and poison a normal catalyst bed. So a lot of the work we had to do up front was to clean the gas and make it suitable for this type of application. But you can see from the exhibit that we have been very successful in reducing the pollutants. So NOx, without the catalyst, we make about 32 parts per million. After we put in the systems, we can get it down to about 2.5 on a regular basis. It operates very well there. In CO, there was a reduction from 345 parts per million down to 6.4, well under the 250 part limit. So it has been very successful. Also in VOC removal. So there were other trace compounds that were problematic, formaldehyde and others, and the CO reducing catalyst is very effective at reducing those levels also way down, so that we are a better neighbor and put less into the overall atmosphere.
Thank you. And do you know of any other facilities that have successfully employed a similar retrofit on similar engines or in a similar application with similar fuel?
I am not familiar with anybody who followed our lead. I think a lot of agencies I'm aware of have shut down their systems or changed them out to do different things. So I think we've gone the extra mile and are happy to do it.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk now about the engine and the incident and the timing involved. You mentioned the backfire. Could you explain, I guess, let us know the date, because it's a little bit different than the petition, and kind of the procedures, what happened from when the backfire happened and the steps that OCSD undertook thereafter?
So we had a backfire in our system on August 17th. So again, from all the work, it took us a while to figure out why it occurred, and why it occurred was very, very important, because there are 7 more of these systems, and we wanted to make sure there wasn't some sort of systemic flaw in either our control system or how it was being operated that would have presented a significant problem to the other trains. Those individual engine trains are incredibly valuable, and if they were to go down one after the other, we could be in some serious difficulty creating energy, making heat, and reusing our gas systems, as well as the safety that goes along with operating with that much power and that much gas. So we took some time after the backfire to figure out, first was an operational error. I think we satisfied ourselves that there was no operator error, if you will. We then started to look at the valving systems that blend and mix the gas, that meter the gas, where was the gas coming from that got through, and we settled after some period of time on the sticky check valve, which is a original equipment manufacturer replacement. So sort of an upgrade, if you will, from the manufacturer from an old technology to a newer system. Unfortunately, we believe the newer system is more prone to this sticking and causing gas pass-through, which could cause the backfire system.
Okay, thank you. And just for context, as we're considering the timing, could you explain to the hearing board more about how projects like this are processed in OCSD's system or prioritized? Can you give us an overview of that?
So the sanitation district has $11 billion in assets across its overall portfolio. So our job is to always look at and prioritize what gets fixed when. There obviously are dollar limitations, and just as importantly, there are people limitations. So as we come across issues, and there's normal wear and tear breakage, there are normal everyday maintenance activities, our job is to manage the proper utilization of all of those resources in a way that makes sense. So on a day-to-day basis, capital changes aside, we're dealing with 600 work orders every single week. just to take care of the 45,000 items at each plant, plus the collection systems that are out there. So when we dispatch our mechanics, when we dispatch our electricians or instrumentation techs, we have to make those decisions on what's the most important thing. We also don't want to have people sitting around waiting for work orders to come, so we schedule out their work 3 weeks in advance. So for normal everyday activities, we have everyone scheduled 3 weeks in advance, making sure everyone's busy, the parts they're going to need are on hand, and the work can be done effectively and efficiently. When things like this happen, it's called break-in work. So you have to take somebody off what is normal preventative maintenance and move them into the corrective maintenance world, and you just start to build a backlog where things start to break, and it can lead to a very difficult cycle where you're always playing catch-up. So we try and be proactive and prioritize preventative maintenance. However, when things like this happen, we have to find the resources to get in place. These are very technical resources we're talking about. This isn't a standard fix a water pump sort of situation. This is a diagnostic situation. So we have to coordinate the engineering resources to troubleshoot what happened and how the fix is going to move forward, along with the underlying blue-collar trades maintenance efforts to support them. So it takes some time to get all that together at the right place. And then all of this is going on while we're doing $185 million a year in capital. So those engineers that you're pulling off the capital jobs or construction jobs are the ones that are also supporting this sort of high-end troubleshooting and maintenance, corrective maintenance type work.
Okay, thank you. And so when you have a project like this that is not standard preventative maintenance and you have to put it in your queue, are there levels of urgency or prioritization? And if so, can you explain how this fits into those?
The sanitation district employs something called a project clearinghouse, where all of our managers across the organization come together biweekly, and they look at all of the competing interests that we faced, whether it's a collection system pump station, an ocean outfall problem, operations within the plant, in the power systems. They look at all of the needs, things that need to be repaired, things that need to be addressed, nice to haves, innovative research projects, and then we make decisions on what gets prioritized and where do we put the people resources and the dollar resources to get projects moving forward. Everything is a balancing act between what's urgent, what's important, and what's nice to have. So this project went through that process also. It was a relatively high priority item. We did put the resources toward it. The hard part for us is this is not just something where it's exclusively internal staff, where no matter how many people you put on it, we needed some extra help from the catalyst vendors, from some of the other high-end mechanical engineering resources that might be available to us to understand how these combustion systems and emission control systems were working together. So anytime you're in a public agency and you're trying to procure outside resources, there are certain steps you go through. Unfortunately, as a public agency, we don't just get to choose who we want to work with and write them a purchase order. We have to go through a process of advertising and have clear scopes of work before we put it out to advertise, and it just takes time to figure out what you want to do, how to put it in a nice document, get prices back, and go through the bid and advertising requirements that you have to go through.
So did you put this project out for general bidding, or was there a different process that you followed?
Because we determined that the overall cost was going to be less than $300,000, the sanitation district recently updated its ordinance for purchasing, and it allowed for what we call a 7-pack process, which is a more expedited way to get work done. With this 7-pack system that recently became available to us, we are able to go to 7 pre-qualified general contractors with a scope of work, give them 2 weeks to look over that bid and expect back bids from them, so that the whole process between having the scope of work ready and having shovels in the ground, if you will, is about 30 days. That's quite a savings over the 12 to actually 16-week period that could be required for a normal award of this size, because you have to have more time for the bid to be on the street, more advertising requirements for a normal process. You then have to go to the Board of Directors, committee and Board of Directors for approval. So when you end up all those things front to back in a series fashion, you end up with about a 12 to 16-week process. Normally, we went through in the March-April timeframe in a 4-week period.
Thank you. Is there a higher level that this project could have been elevated to under the governing ordinance?
If it were deemed an emergency, we could have circumvented all of the purchasing policies and gone straight to hiring whoever we liked, brought them in, and in an emergency fashion made these repairs.
Does the project fit the ordinances or your other governing documents' definitions of an emergency?
It does not. Because we have 5 engines, this is a standby engine. We are able to meet our permit requirements, save the testing of this one item. There are no excess emissions being generated because the engine is off and has been off since that time. The 4 engines that we have currently can convert all the gas we're making into electricity and heat, and they can do it meeting all the permit requirements we have, so it didn't qualify in our minds as an emergency action.
Okay. And if this was a standby engine and you have 5 engines total, if you were to have another engine go down at the plant, would that change the status, or what would that do to your either heat generation or electricity generation and processing?
Especially in the winter months, it would become a very difficult problem because we could be heat short, meaning that we use the heat from the engines to heat the fluid in the digesters up to 95 degrees. And without 4 engines available in certain times of the winter, it can be a very difficult proposition. If we don't keep the digesters at 95 degrees, then we don't meet our permit requirements for biosolids processing. It's a very important 15-day, 95-degree minimum requirement to meet biosolids standards.
Okay, thank you. And just to take us back to the timeline a little bit, we had the engine backfire occur on August 17th, and then you mentioned March and April is when we had the bidding. And just recap for us kind of what went on between that time, developing the scope of work and the steps involved just generally.
So from a general perspective, the first step is to step back and figure out what exactly went wrong. So the first place I think most minds would go is they've been operating well, something happened, there must be some sort of operational error. So we took a bit of time to look over all the operating parameters. We have the computerized systems that show us which control operations were made, what was done. We had to go back and look and make sure the engine was operated correctly. That takes some time to dig through. Again, the engineers that are tasked with this have other duties. They're not exclusively looking at SenGen. Before January of this year, we were organized a bit differently, and we had some civil engineers with some energy background supporting this area. Since that time, we've reorganized with a new program where we try and more tightly align the expertise of the engineers involved. We call them area engineers now. So we have a mechanical engineer that has taken over since January, supporting SenGen very directly, because engine control and engine maintenance is much more mechanical engineering based than it is civil engineering based. The person that was doing it was good. I think the person we have doing now is a little bit stronger in this area. So we really were able to move more quickly since January with the production of the scope of work and making sure it met all of our standards to make sure we're getting a good quality project and the corrections wouldn't cause longer term problems.
Okay, thank you. And so in the March and April timeframe, because it sounds like this was an iterative process that takes us there, what occurred with respect to putting the project out for bid in that 30-day period you mentioned?
So we used that 7-pack system that we talked about, where a scope of work was created, and this was the scope for, it's 17 pages up front to describe the work that needs to be done, and then a lot of attachments on the original installation and all the pipe stress and background information that a general contractor could need. So as we created the scope of work, we sent it out to our 7 qualified general contractors. We believe we scared them to a certain extent by handing them a 3/4 inch thick document with pipe stress and isometric drawings and characteristics of performance criteria, and we only got back 1 proposal. And that 1 proposal was about 9 or 10 times the engineer's estimate. So we think the one guy who did propose threw a number at it high enough that he couldn't possibly lose money. So what we've done is to kind of step back and streamline. It's the same scope of work without all the heavy attachments, taking a little more time to talk our 7 normal contractors through what we're asking for, and we're about ready to put that back on the street to them and get our 2-week turnaround for the next bid.
Okay, so you're in the process of rebidding the project?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for taking us to about the present day. Based on your experience at OCSD, is this project moving through the clearinghouse in as timely a manner as possible, giving its priority status elevated?
It is, and the fact that these engines are so unique is always a challenge, because finding people that are comfortable working on them is difficult. There aren't too many engines like this around, and finding the expertise to work on them is more challenging.
Okay. And then also based on your assessment and understanding to date, including the root cause analysis, was the original engine backfire preventable that you're aware?
I don't believe so, because we've identified the check valve as the sticking part. What we have done is taken those new Rev 2 check valves out of the warehouse. They're no longer going to be used. We're going to go back to the old style, which have been working for 25 years. We know how to make those work. We know how to service those. Takes a little more effort, but obviously the risk isn't worth the reward for the new check valves.
Okay. And if you were not granted the variance today, what would that mean for OCSD in terms of coming into compliance and priorities that you're addressing?
It would basically be a hardship for us. There's no way for us to get this thing back in shape before the deadline in 2 weeks. It just isn't going to happen. There's no possibility.
Is that because you can't call this an emergency?
Whether we could or couldn't,
yeah.
to get the parts, to get the pieces, to mobilize the contractor, it just doesn't happen that quickly.
Okay. And in terms of the excess emissions, there haven't been any excess emissions since the event occurred in August 2016?
The machine is shut down. The machine hasn't created any emissions since the backfire.
And do you expect that the engine will be shut down throughout the variance period?
Absolutely.
And it will not result in any excess emissions throughout?
There's no intention to restart that engine until it's fully operational.
Okay. And if the variance is granted, does OCSD intend to continue monitoring and quantifying or reporting the emissions as required?
Absolutely.
Okay. And have you considered curtailing the operations in lieu of requesting the variance, meaning shutting down the engine longer or other reasons?
The engine is shut down. It has been shut down. We have the capacity. Long term, we need this engine back because we have to start rebuilding all of our engines one at a time. We've reached the 25-year period. They have about 140,000 operating hours, and we're going to start rebuilding them from the bottom up. It's just the normal maintenance that you do with any engine of this style. So we need the full flexibility of the entire system so that we can begin this rebuilding process midlife of the 50-year cycle.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And have you had a chance to review the conditions that were circulated by the district this morning?
I have.
Okay, and those conditions would impose enforceable deadlines for the completion of those specific milestones. Is OCSD prepared to agree to those milestones?
We're committed to meeting those milestones.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Feldman. Questions?
Yes, thank you. According to Exhibit 1, these engines, all 5, were installed in 1995. Is that correct?
They went online in 1995, I believe.
And do you know what the expected useful life is of these engines?
In my mind, 50 years.
50 years, okay. So I guess they're worth repairing now. Are all the engines, including the number 3 standby, equipped with these upgraded valves?
They're basically, the check valves?
Yeah.
Not anymore. 3 was the first one, and when the backfire occurred, we stopped any further retrofits while we were figuring out what was going on.
Okay, so do any of the others have the upgraded valves?
No.
Okay, so you're not, there's no concern about a recurrence of this problem in,
That was the number one concern, and we wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be a problem. So once that was the root cause identified, we stopped all further purchases and installations of those valves.
okay. Now, your counsel in her opening statement made mention of the SCR being impacted also by the backfire of the engine. Could you explain to the hearing board what the SCR is and what it does for the machine?
There are 2 catalyst beds, and they're big open spots in the pipe, and you put in precious metal beds, and as the exhaust goes through those precious metal beds, it catalyzes any unburnt fuel or nitrous oxides, converts them to nitrogen, converts CO to CO2, depending on which bed you're talking about. It kind of looks like an air filter, if you've ever seen it. So as the air passes through, as the gas passes through, the precious metals in those beds allow the final conversion of the unwanted pollutants to baser or more stable compounds. The reason they were impacted is when the backfire occurred, the pressure wave of the explosion is passing through those, yeah. If you refer back to the engine damage slide in Exhibit 1, you'll see Figure 1 shows how those plates sort of slide into that overall housing, and they're kind of flimsy is the wrong word, but they aren't made to handle a pressure wave going through them, and it breaks or twists and bends the plates that are holding the catalyst in place. So once that pressure wave goes through, you basically ruin the catalyst plates and you have to buy new.
Is that SCR dedicated to engine number 3, or does it serve other pieces of equipment as well?
Each is its own individual train. So 3 is served only by its own set of catalyst beds.
Okay, so the loss of that particular SCR, air pollution control equipment, will not impact the operation of the other engines?
That is correct.
Has engine number 3 or any of the others at the facility failed a source test since the rule was adopted in 2012? Okay, I will wait for the next, I will wait. Okay. When the backfire occurred in August of last year, was there any rule violation at that point?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
can defer, you can
I
ask
will
very
defer that one as well. Had you done the source test in June of 2018? Is that another question for, okay. I'm getting ahead of myself. Now that you're going back, you're reverting to the older valves. Is there going to be any problem getting replacements for those valves as you continue to
believe
operate
so.
these engines? No? Okay. You also testified that the engine will not be operated during the variance period, but you're not including the tune-up and testing, right?
There will be a point where everything's put in place, and yes, you will have to start it, but we can start and stop it within the confines of the permit.
Okay. I have no further questions for the witness. Thank you.
Thank you. Board members, Mr. Balagopalan.
Mr. Thompson, trying to understand, you said the jet fuel, the jet injects the natural gas into there, and so because the valve was sticky, it didn't get, it just went through. Now, why didn't the catalytic oxidizer downstream from there, would it not have burned the excess natural gas? Because normally it would take care of the unburned fuel, right?
So, stepping back, when you're starting the engine, you're getting it up to speed and it's rolling. You should not be injecting gas into the engine until it's up to speed. So while that engine is spinning up to speed, if the jet cell fuel is allowing gas to pass through that check valve, the sparks aren't yet, the spark plug isn't yet firing necessarily because you're starting the engine, and it gets into the cycle where you're starting the engine. And the fact is, because the natural gas was going through and the engine's working, the valves are opening and closing, that's how the gas was allowed to pass unburnt into that overall system. It wouldn't get ignited until it hit the first bed, if it were up to temperature already. So there's a lot that goes into how the fuel can get into the exhaust pipe, but then once it hits that catalyst, if there's unburnt fuel, it can come back.
Upstream from the catalyst is the catalytic oxidizer, though. That is running in operation, right? When
it has to get up to temperature, like any car in a warm-up. The catalytic converter starts cold, so you can build up the gas while you're in the startup sequence.
so the unburned gas is just passing through then to the catalyst. Okay. At what temperature? When in the sequence, when does the catalytic oxidizer is up and running? How long does it take once the engine is?
I would be speaking beyond my knowledge if I knew the minutes.
So was this a cold start of the engine? I mean, typically, the engines are continuously running, are they not?
They're not. We cycle our engines over time. We take them in and out of service.
So this happened while it was out and it was put back
so.
into service in that period, okay. So now then you had the backfire, the catalyst. How much of the catalyst were damaged? I see some from the pictures, it says 4 panels. So were they all damaged or only certain portions of the catalyst?
I believe the answer is 4 of 16, but if you want a very definite answer, we can bring up the mechanical engineer.
So my question, do you have to replace just those only or the whole, all the catalysts?
At least those 4 will do the determination. I don't know.
And was there an actual fire, the backfire? Was there, just the pressure wave just dislodged him?
I think it's safe to say, based on the damage, there was an explosion within that pipe, which is what the backfire is.
Right.
If you look at the figure number 2, under the engine damage, you can see a base plate that's been deformed. So there was a significant amount of energy and twisting. The bellows are all blown out. It was a significant pressure wave.
So then what other damage could it have also done upstream to the, besides the catalyst, was there other damage to the ductwork or even to the oxidizer with the pressure wave flowing backward?
We've looked at all of the systems from the silencer at the top all the way back to the engine itself, and that's what the scope of work is, to replace all the parts and pieces.
Okay. Let's see, something else. And you said, you've replaced the sticky valve with the older, and so.
All 16.
All 16. And so, that's right, it's a 16-cylinder engine, yeah. And that's huge. So when you start back on, would you initially do it to make sure that the valves are not sticking? Would you do it with the controls not in place and then check to see, and then slowly add back the controls?
It doesn't work that way. What we have to do is make sure that the valves are operating correctly. It's a mechanical device. There's no electronics to it. It's basically a little ball that goes up and down in the cylinder. They had a nice, elegant design for 2.0, but we're just going back to the old tried and true seated ball going back and forth.
So somebody can it's not something you can visually see because it's
buried deep in the head of the engine.
in the engine. So
And
the only
we look at it every 1,500 and 3,000 hours.
so the test whether it's not sticking anymore is whether any unburned gas is going through then.
That would be your first indication that one is failing, yes.
And so would you still do it with the controls on? And what I'm trying to get at is there a period of time where you have to do without the controls and then later,
We'll spend more time looking at the condition of the gas in the exhaust system and do more where we shut off the gas completely in the valves up front. So before you get to the check valve, there are the mixing valves and then the overall feed valve system. We can make sure that we run the engine and push more clean air through by shutting off gas to the engine. So yeah, we'll pay very close attention to how that gas is introduced.
So what's your confidence level that your root cause analysis identified this been the real issue, or is there something else?
Very confident.
In the high 90s or more, and there was not other factors that could have contributed?
We don't believe so.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Berg?
Excuse me. Was it your testimony that you need to run 4 engines at a time? Is that why this wasn't urgent to?
In general, at our Huntington Beach plant, we run 3 engines at any one time.
Oh, okay. And so
We're
you're,
permitted to run 4. So this isn't necessarily urgent at this point, like an emergency urgent, because we have that capability. Wet weather, it is a little more dicey where we need more power, and you need all 4. But we've been able to run this year and through next, we believe.
and you've only needed to run those 3 even during that period where you say in winter things are at a higher volume?
In addition to the central generation system, because of our EPA requirements for treatment, we also had diesels throughout the plant. So in the event of a complete power outage during high flow, we can segregate different loads in the plant to diesel power for short periods of time and use all available CenGen power in the plant.
Okay. And that cycle of inspection of 1,500 and 3,000 hours, that's the manufacturer's recommendation?
Yes.
Okay. And and I know this is what the petition says, but I'm just going to state it for the record. The only thing that you're looking for coverage relief from is the date by which you had to have the source test done because this engine was down, and that's all.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Have you had backfires in these engines before, any of them, the 5?
Yes.
When have those occurred, and how often?
The last I ever remember hearing of a backfire was actually in the 1990s. And it was really a case where the gas wasn't cleaned nearly to the extent that it currently is. And you would get sticky check valves because of deposits from siloxanes or some of the other minor pollutants that used to exist before we did gas treatment. So in the old days, we haven't had one since the catalysts were introduced, but in the old days, the exhaust pipe went directly to a steam converter and then to the roof through a silencer. So the backfires were much smaller because there was much less volume. And it was a much less pressure constrained because it wasn't going through the catalyst bed. It just went straight through a steam system through an exhaust pipe out the roof. So it was a much less problematic thing 15, 20 years ago.
But the gas now has been treated to an extent where,
It's pre-cleaned before it goes to the engine through activated carbon. So siloxanes and H2S are removed from the system.
and how often have any of the 5 engines gone down for a significant time because of an issue with one or more of the engines?
It's pretty rare. We're at that condition now at Plant 1, where we're looking to do the overall rebuild. It's a completely different issue. It's got 140,000 hours of use, and it's time for the major rebuild. We're working to get our contractors on board, and I guarantee you we'll be doing source testing before we start that engine rebuild.
And have you did mention before that you were about to start the major rebuilds, and I know that the district has expressed some concerns at the beginning regarding the timing that this will take. Have you noticed any issues with the engines, aside from the fact that it is time to do a rebuild? Have you noticed any deterioration or any other performance issues in any of the engines?
Yes, we have. You can see oil consumption is the key. That tells you when you're starting to get near the tolerance limits within the engine.
And the conditions and the time frame by which you have agreed with the district with regard to the proposed variance conditions, that will fit within the time that you have determined you need to begin rebuilding these engines?
We believe so.
Okay. With regard to some of the timeframes that are in the proposed conditions, first of all, you mentioned that the original scope of work that went out, and you only received one proposal. Was that in April?
Yes.
Okay, so when you, in your petition on page 6, paragraph 16, at the very bottom where it says the bidding period ends in April 2019, was that the bidding process that produced a single bid?
Correct.
Okay. So now you have to you've now repeating that. And so is that why you don't anticipate you will be able to execute a contract until August 31st?
That is correct.
Okay. Even with this what's that called? The 7-pack process? So generally, you testified the 7-pack process generally takes 2 weeks to receive bids.
Right?
And in this situation, let me start from the beginning. When does the bid go back out, or is it already back out?
It will be back out within the next 2 weeks, I believe.
Okay. And then how long do you anticipate for bids to come back?
Another 2 weeks?
Okay. So that would take us to essentially the end of June? And then you anticipate 2 months to consider a bid from there and execute a contract?
1 month. August 1st?
Well, you have August
Or
31st.
There's always the possibility that there will be irregularities, there will be protests. When you're working in the public arena, lots of people have lots of rights, and if we're going to commit to something, we want to make sure we can deliver.
Okay. So that's would you say that's a very conservative estimate in terms of August 31st?
I would use the term practical based on my public contracting experience.
Okay. And then in terms of this schedule in the proposed conditions, you have in condition number 2 a completion of construction date of November 30th, and then testing March 31st of 2020. And in between that time, corrective maintenance and tuning of engines. Is that usual, that it would take 4 months from final completion of construction to the actual testing?
A lot depends on the contractor and their ability to go through those final parts and pieces, punch list, make sure it's ready to go. In addition, that's during our wet weather period, so we need to make sure that we will have the staff available to very carefully start this engine. If it's a wet year and there are lots of competing interests for our commissioning and maintenance staff, this is important, but if we're fighting high flows and dealing with other issues that inevitably arise with a system of our size, we want to make sure that we can meet the requirements.
Is it usual that it would take 4 months?
I wouldn't call it usual, but I wouldn't call it uncommon either. Depends on the contractor.
What, can you just describe a little bit more? Okay, so you mentioned that you need 3 engines. You have 4 currently. In the winter, it could be cold enough where you would require all 4, is that correct?
For heat, yes.
Okay, and that seems to coincide with the same time that this engine would be constructed and before the emissions testing. What would happen if one of the engines goes down and you require 4 engines, but you only have now 3? What happens? What is the result?
The first thing we do is we have supplemental heat boilers. So we would try our best to meet the heat requirement at plant number 2 with supplemental boilers. We have the ability to move flows between the plants. So we can increase the flow going to the Fountain Valley plant to reduce the loads seen by the Huntington Beach plant. If there are individual days with high flow, that 10-year storm comes along and we're maxed out, that's when we'll fire up our diesels. Everything boils down to instant triage, if you will, depending on the scenario. But for the day-to-day needs of the plant, assuming it's a dry winter, we'd never be pushed to that level, but we have multiple layers of redundancy and resiliency to react as necessary.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? The Senator.
Very complex system.
Yes, sir.
You explained it in detail. However, you stated that the backfire occurred on the August 17th. You said that.
Yes, sir.
In the petition, it says August 27th, which is correct.
17th.
So we'll change that date then. The long process of troubleshooting the system, trying to determine the cause and perhaps repairs to engine number 3. You got it outlined here, which is detailed and very time consuming. And yet, in the final analysis, we're looking at the efficiency of the total system. Is that correct? The efficiency of the system to prevent pollution being dumped into, isn't that the purpose?
This engine is a standalone engine, and when it's turned off, the systems that are out of service right now are isolated only to engine number 3. Each engine has its own catalyst system, its own train, if you will.
So number 3, which is being recommended by EPA, is that included in the other systems as well?
Number 3 is a standalone train. Number 1, 2, 4, and 5 are operating as designed, with all the equipment as designed, and operating within their permit requirements.
Or do they meet the EPA requirements, and known as the Central General System or the National Pollution Discharge that EPA is asking for? Would the other system do the same thing?
Yes. We're meeting all of our permit requirements. In fact, we just received a platinum award for our 6th consecutive year with no water violations.
And this sticky cell is the first time you had this problem with the system.
This was our first adoption of a new type of check valve, and it's obviously, we believe, problematic and prone to sticking. So
When was it incorporated in the system?
it was early part of last year.
Last year, and it operated very well up until
It didn't cause a
the
problem.
early part of last year, you say, huh?
Early part of 18.
Was the only place in this system, the other plants?
It was not put in the other engines. This, number 3 was the first place this new style check valve was used, and it caused the problem. And it hasn't been used in the other engines.
So what about a simple repair job, like take that out and put another one in that would work?
You open the head, there's a head on each of the cylinders. You open that head, you have to get in, and the check valve is embedded within the head. You pull that out, it goes back in. That's where the spark plug mechanism, the coils for the spark plug, and the check valve are all embedded in that same assembly.
You're talking about a preventative maintenance. Explain that.
Every 1,500 hours, they go through and look at the jet cells, the check valves, clean them out for any material that may have become embedded in there. They balance the pressure. They have the ability to adjust the firing pressure of each of the cylinders. That's the normal 1,500 and 3,000 hour service.
And all
8 engines.
You also stated that during this process, you have personnel on standby and work orders prepared before there is a failure. Explain that.
Well, we have, again, 45,000 items that we take care of at each plant, from the pumping systems, all the instrumentation, the computer controls throughout both treatment plants and the collection system. Each one has, whether it's a pump, a variable speed drive controlling a pump, motor control center, switchgear. We have our own 12,000 volt electrical distribution system. All of these complex engineered systems make up the overall whole that we're trying to run there. And all of them require normal maintenance and service, whether it's electronics, mechanical wear devices, pumps, valves, mixing systems for digesters, major basically cement pumps to move our solids from our digesters. We have centrifuge systems, drying our cake. It's $11 billion all humming along, requiring maintenance and a very gritty, difficult service.
With engine number 3 out of service, it doesn't have an adverse effect on your reliability of the system?
We have lost one layer of resiliency and protection. We have the ability to deal with it through flow movements, as well as alternate electrical supply and alternate heat supplies. So long-term for efficiency, we want it back, but it doesn't have an adverse impact on our day-to-day operations at this point.
What about the reliability of wastewater treatment operation and potentially resulting to sewer spillage? Has that occurred, or can it occur with 3 being out of service?
3 will not be the reason we have a sewage spill.
Have you had it before, a sewage spill?
The answer is always, unfortunately, yes. But I can tell you that we haven't had a violation in either of our treatment plants in 6 years. The last sewage spill from a treatment plant, I believe, dates back to the early 1990s.
Not since 1990 have you had a sewage?
A sewage spill in the treatment plant? We've had some in our collection systems.
Tell me where you've had it, in the plant or collection system or elsewhere.
Out in the collection system, the industry standard, I believe, is 2.1 spills per 100 miles of sewer. The sanitation district had its last sewage spill on Newport Boulevard in the city of Newport Beach during a rainstorm in 2017, I believe.
And you didn't get a notice of violation?
From the State Water Quality Control Board, yes, we went through the process with them.
You didn't?
It wasn't a notice of violation, I don't believe.
We should probably steer clear of anything outside of air quality and this particular variance.
I'm trying to find out about the in the petition, they talked about the reliability and the efficiency of the plant operation. So that's what I'm getting to. That's a failure. It's not part of the plant operation.
The collection system has nothing to do with the overall plant operation. They're hydraulically independent. The water coming in comes through our headwork system. At that point, if the water's lifted out of the collection system, then it's in the treatment plant, and the treatment plant operates by gravity in its own internal systems.
What's the purpose of engine number 3 then? If it's not talking about the efficiency of the system?
Engine number 3 is part of a 5-engine system, which provides us 16 megawatts of backup capacity in a high flow situation. On a day-to-day basis, we don't need the entire high flow number. So on a regular basis, we treat about 185 million between the two plants. In a wet weather situation, we can treat up to 620 million gallons a day. So engine number 3 would be called into service theoretically in a high flow situation for a short amount of time. However, we also have the ability to divert flow, use alternate electrical supply means. There are any number of ways to work around it. Engine number 3 is one of the many assets we have to meet the overall need.
So engine number 3 used periodically?
If engine number 3 were working, it would be in the rotation with the other 4 engines.
Not consistently?
It's consistent, it would consistently be within the rotation.
Right in the
We
rotation.
would be using 3 and just rotating through the 5 engines.
I understand. But the others can carry the load if engine number 3 is not in operation.
Correct.
And you can still meet those pollution levels shown in Exhibit 2?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Balagopalan?
Mr. Thompson, the other 4 engines, are they somewhat on the same schedule for testing? And has the testing been conducted?
I will defer.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you.
Any other questions for this witness? Okay, seeing none, we'll take our break, our mid-morning break, and let's be back at 10:30. We're off the record. We're back on the record, and Ms. Gross, you were going to introduce your next witness, correct?
Thank you. I'd like to introduce Rhonda Abushaban. Could you please state your name and spell it also for the record?
Rhonda Abushaban, Randa, last name Abushaban. Abushaban as in boy, An as in Nancy.
Thank you. And have you been administered the oath today?
Yes, I have.
What is your position at OCSD?
Regulatory specialist.
And what is your background?
Chemical engineering. I'm a certified project management professional and certified energy manager.
And what are your job responsibilities at OCSD?
At OCSD, I work in the Environmental Services Department, Air Quality Compliance Team.
Okay, and are you familiar with the rules and permit conditions that are the subject of the variance today?
Yes, I am.
I'd like to ask you some questions specifically related to OCSD's efforts to comply with the rules. Can you please remind us what are the specific permit conditions and air district rules from which OCSD requests variance relief?
So we are here requesting variance relief from 2 permits and 2 conditions. The permit that regulates the engine itself, Resource Recovery Engine number 3, and that is permit number G as in George 43799. Condition number 15 to be exact, that stipulates the source testing requirement. Also, we are requesting relief from the air emissions control system for engine number 3, and that is permit number G as in George 43807, specifically condition number 11 that requires I demonstrate compliance with the ammonia slip limit, and it's done via the source testing.
Okay, and can you explain how you are or will be in violation of that permit those permit conditions?
Due to the backfire incident on engine number 3 back on August 17th, the engine has been down. I am unable to source test the engine until it becomes operable, so I am able to test it to normal operating conditions.
And what is the timing, or why is there an imminent violation?
The permit stipulates annual source testing. The last source test on this engine was performed on June 7th, 2018. Annual would give me a final deadline to source test by June 7th, 2019. Due to the engine being down at this time, I'm unable to meet the June 7th, 2019 compliance deadline.
Okay, thank you. And I want to, referring back as you need to Mr. Thompson's testimony, could you please explain to us how you came to file the variance petition when you did, and the timeframes and dates and things that were happening around that time?
So environmental compliance, we were notified by operations of the incident upon the incident on August 17th, 2018. And so we've been in continuous communication with operations and asset management. As Mr. Thompson alluded to earlier, it took some time to resolve the diagnostic root cause analysis and the internal affairs that came with that of trying to determine the event, trying to determine root cause, repair options, internal repair options versus external repair options, procurement opportunities, and then leading up to the March original first bid. And so from that point, we were still hopeful that had that bid successfully gone through and awarded, then we could have potentially met the June 7th compliance date. When it became clear that the bids came in, as Mr. Thompson said, 9 times higher than the originally anticipated, we went ahead and prepared and submitted the variance application.
Okay, thank you. I want to, perhaps this was what Ms. Feldman was referring to earlier, but I wanted to address one of the attachments to the petition that you had included, and that was the notice of violation for equipment that was subject to the petition. OCSD answered yes to that question on the petition, which is number 12. Can you please explain to us both the dates, how the timing works and what, how that relates to what's before us, if it does relate.
So, yes. So in accordance with paragraph number 12, we reference NOV number P as in Paul 63094. This NOV was issued on May 22nd, 2018, which is prior to the date of the actual backfire incident. The NOV stipulated descriptions, including submittal of the semi-annual report, which was submitted 1 week post its submittal date. And so compliance was immediately achieved upon that submittal. And then the failure to conduct the performance source test within 180 days after initial startup, which occurred in 2016. So compliance has been achieved on the stipulated violations in this specific NOV.
Okay. And just very briefly, what was the cause of it looks like a 1 week delay of the report and the slight delay of the source testing?
As stated in our NOV response letter dated June 19th, 2018, OCSD submitted a response to the NOV where we dictated the causes leading to the event and the immediate corrective action. And as stated in there, OCSD was investigating breakdown incidents that had occurred at the plants that we needed to investigate prior to making a thorough semi-annual report submittal.
Okay, and just to be clear, this is a far earlier time frame than the backfire, is that?
That is correct.
Okay.
The NOV was issued on May 22nd, 2018, and the backfire occurred on August 17th, 2018.
Okay, and does this have anything, does the NOV relate in any way, is it the underlying issue related to the backfire?
No, it is not.
Okay, so did you include the NOV because the petition asks?
Because the petition asked and it was within the 1 year.
Okay. And so I think, okay, that makes sense. And so the issue with the engine and the source testing today is not necessarily related to the NOV at all?
That is correct. There's no correlation.
Okay. So if you, I wanted to also switch gears for a minute and talk about next steps towards compliance. Can you remind us or tell us OCSD's plan towards compliance and the timing and the steps that you're taking?
Our immediate near-term strategy and plan is to procure and repair the engine and bring the engine back online as fast as possible. Long-term, we are working with AQMD permitting staff on streamlining our permits to operate. And so on March 14th, 2019, we submitted a permit modification application package to AQMD requesting specific changes to our existing permits to allow us the flexibility in accordance with Rule 1110.2 when engines are down for more than 3 months.
Okay, so that's your long-term plan. Can you explain what the permit modification or the flexibility exactly is?
So in addition to some administrative items, the goal of the permit modification is to modify the condition 15 of the permit to operate for the resource recovery as it relates to the source testing. So in accordance with Rule 1110.2 F1C, allowing us to await source testing of an engine when an engine is down for more than 3 months. So basically streamlining the permit in accordance with the rule.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, your permit has a requirement to test annually, but the rule allows you to test whenever, within a certain time after the permit comes up?
That's correct.
Or after the engine comes up?
When the
Okay.
engine is operable. Mhm.
Okay. And have you been in contact with Air District staff about that?
OCSD permitting staff and the air quality team, environmental compliance, have been in continuous communication with AQMD permitting staff, correct?
Okay, and do you know when you anticipate receiving a decision on your permit modification application?
I will defer that to AQMD permitting staff to give us a timeline.
And I only ask that because if you receive approval of the permit modification before May 15th, 2020, will you still need variance coverage beyond that time?
We will not.
Do you, do you know what the rule will say, though? I mean, do you know what the modification will say?
We do not know what the final permit language will be. We don't have the draft permit issued yet, so we have not seen what the proposed language will look like. But so that is pending the proposed language and the issuance of the permit.
Okay, so to ask the question again, does it depend on what the final language says, whether you need variance coverage or not?
That is correct.
Okay, so is it fair to say that if you receive the necessary permit modification language that gives you the flexibility on the source testing for your engine, that you won't need variance coverage, but if the language is changed, then you will still need coverage until May 15th?
That is correct.
Okay. Can you please explain some of the steps going forward from now until the end of that time period, the May 15th, 2020?
So I will defer a portion of that to Riaz to talk about the procurement demands and the commissioning demands, which include corrective maintenance and tuning of the system. When I will speak moving forward from March 1st, 2020, up until May 15th, 2020, when the engine is officially passed on to environmental services for source testing and validation of compliance. So I have an existing contract already issued to Energy Environmental Solutions to execute source testing on all 8 engines at both plants. So once engine 3 becomes available per the anticipated timeline, I will coordinate the source testing effort with EES on dispatching and executing source testing efforts. Once source testing, which is a one-day effort, once that is completed, the turnaround of an official compliance report is up to 45 days. So within receiving that final report, we will turn it around and submit to AQMD for final demonstration of compliance, hopefully no later than May 15th, 2020.
Okay. And just to understand, so when the engine is completed, or the tuning of the engine and the emissions control system is completed, the source testing might take place within a 30-day period thereafter?
That is correct. The goal is to execute source testing within 30 days. We allow the source tester to give us his availability within a 30-day window. So I am at his or her mercy to give me first available. Now, proactively, while we are toward nearing the end of the engine tuning and emission system tuning effort, I will initiate the conversation and discussion with the source tester. So hopefully that once the engine is passed on to environmental compliance, we can turn around a source test within a few weeks.
So it's possible it wouldn't take as long, but this period allows for practical considerations?
I am at the mercy of the source tester's schedule.
Okay, thank you. And just to clarify, in the petition, the OCSD had requested the variance period to last through June 7th, 2020, but based on the timeline and the conditions, respondents Exhibit 1, have you revised that proposed final compliance date?
That is correct. So OCSD is committed to achieving compliance by demonstration of the final source test report by May 15th, 2020.
Okay. And other than the details that you're deferring to our next witness, is there anything else that you can add to Mr. Thompson's testimony that would be helpful for the hearing board to know as they consider the findings they need to make.
So I would just want to iterate that the engine has been down since the date of the backfire incident, and no excess emissions have been produced as a result of this incident or up to present, or up to May 2020. OCSD has been an environmental steward and partner with AQMD for many years. Most recently, the hydrogen fuel cell demonstration project, the actual catalyst emission project on all 8 engines at OCSD was a collaborative effort with AQMD rulemaking staff and development. We have had a history of a positive working rapport with permitting, rulemaking, and enforcement staff.
Thank you. No further questions.
Ms. Feldman, questions for Ms. Abou-Shaban?
Yes, just a couple. Was the engine source tested in June of 2018? Engine number 3, was it source tested in June of 2018?
That is correct.
And it passed that source test?
That is correct.
Okay. Has this engine or any of the others at plant number 2 failed a source test since 2012?
Yes. Engine 3 specifically failed an ammonia slip limit in 2017, which was immediately retested and demonstrated compliance.
Okay. Would the failure of that source test indicated that there was some internal problem with the engine that needed to be addressed?
There was an issue with the heat recovery boiler that was addressed.
And that resolved the problem?
That was the problem, correct.
Okay. When the backfire occurred in August of last year, was there any rule violation at that point?
Rule violation at that point, no excess emissions were dictated by the continuous emissions monitoring system. So the engine was immediately brought down and shut down from operation. So we do not believe there was a rule.
Okay, so you had no reason to petition for a variance then?
Correct.
At what point did it occur to you that you're not going to make the June source test deadline and therefore would need a variance protection?
Eminent communication started in collaboration with operations and maintenance in April when it became clear that the received bid came in at 9 times and that we were unable to proceed with that procurement. So proactively, environmental compliance staff had already started preparation of the variance petition paperwork. So at that point, it was easy for us to just submit and proceed with the submittal.
Okay, I have no further questions.
I just had one follow-up question with regard to that testimony, with regard to the fact that you testified that as of April, before you received the single bid, you believed that there would be compliance by June. Is that correct?
That is correct. We believe that so with regards to, just to clarify, with regards to the procurement process, it's a 2-week process, as Mr. Thompson indicated. So during that 2-week process, the project manager has access to the procurement portal. So he's able to see live the bids that are coming in. So once it became evident that what we received was in excess of what we can proceed with, we went ahead and proceed with the variance because it became clear that we're unable to meet the June 7th, 2019.
I guess that what I need a little explanation on is, so April, when you would have received bids, to June 7th is only a couple of months.
That's correct.
But you've presented a timeline to come into compliance now.
That's correct.
That's almost a year.
That's correct.
So how do we reconcile those two things? Why a year when you thought you'd be in compliance within 2 months?
Correct. So at that point, it would have been, and Mr. Rios Moanadine can add more to it during his testimony, it would have been a high priority accelerated effort, and all hands on deck at that point to bring the engine on before the June 7th deadline.
Okay, so it's no longer high priority, but it would have been to meet the deadline?
It still is a high priority.
Okay, so then that doesn't, if it still is a high priority, I'm just trying to understand. I know when we talked to Mr. Thompson, it seemed like there was a lot of cushion built into the proposed timeline. So I'm trying to understand, that's a very big discrepancy between a high priority that would be done in 2 months and a high priority that will be done in a year. So is there something that you've learned since
Absolutely.
April?
And I think it's more appropriate for Mr. Riaz to talk about the timeline moving forward up until March of 2020, when I anticipate the engine to be passed on to me.
Okay, but your testimony, I will wait then, but your testimony is that you believed that within 2 months you would have any construction completed, any corrective maintenance done, any tuning of engines done, and testing done by June 7th.
That was our hopeful wish list, yes.
Okay, thank you. Other questions for, I want to get your name right, Ms. Abu Shaban?
Yes, Ms. Abu Shafan. You cited Rule 1110.2. Is it F1C? Or
It is, I have the permit application in front of me. So it is condition 15, primarily, condition 15 of permit number G43797. Or, no, hold on, I apologize, that's engine 1. She included all the engines in here, but I'll go to condition 15. The condition 15 is the same in all the central generation permits. And it is 1110.2 F1C.
F1C. So according to Rule 1110.2, you have the flexibility of not doing the test until the engine is back on, and you got 15 days to do that.
Correct.
However, your permit condition doesn't reflect that.
The existing permit to operate does not reflect that. It reflects annual source testing.
Annual source, and doesn't give the flexibility that is there in 1110.2. And so you've submitted application to modify all the permits, all 5,
That is correct.
and to give you the flexibility in case that happens.
That is correct.
You mentioned the ammonia slip. Do you have the numbers when the test was conducted in June 2018, what the ammonia slip was at that time?
2018.
You mentioned, I think Ms. Feldman asked you, I think it failed in 2017, it was subsequently retested.
In 2017, it was retested immediately to demonstrate compliance. Last year was a separate source test. Trying to see if I have the copy of the actual source test with me. And I did not bring with me a copy of the source test from last year.
That's okay. No, the numbers is impressive, 1110.2 limits. I mean, you're meeting, way below the rule requirement. And as I think Mr. Thompson pointed out, some of the other water agencies are having problems. Do you know why? What is it you're doing differently at this facility that is allowing you to meet the 1110.2 limits?
So when it comes to the technology, we are the only POTW that we are aware that is processing. Our gas has historically been cleaner than a lot of traditional digester gas. I'm referring to digester gas than other traditional wastewater treatment agencies. We have a sophisticated carbon filter treatment for treatment of the gas, the SCR catalyst, the oxidation catalyst, the automation of our controls. There's multiple components that I'm sure Riaz and Mr. Thompson can speak more intelligently about with regards to the actual emissions control project that went down in 2015.
Okay, thank you.
And to answer your question, I did locate the source test.
Oh, okay.
And the ammonia slip number on June 7th, 2018 was 4.79.
And what was the permit limit?
5
5.
at 15% O2.
Okay, thank you.
Board members, Senator?
On page 6, November the 1st,
Are you referring to page 6 of the petition?
Petition,
Thank you.
November 1st, 2018, the project was escalated to urgent. That's what it says right here. And that being the case, on December the 6th, 2018, after troubleshooting the system, you started to go out for bids for repairs as it all had been decided, correct?
I am going to defer any timeline questions to Mr. Riaz's testimony.
Were you systems engineer on this stuff too?
I am the environmental compliance regulatory
Right,
specialist.
well, don't you have some idea about this? Can you answer the question, yes or no?
So repeat the question, please.
On December the 6th, 2018, it was, the scope of work development was ready to go out to bid.
On December 6, 2018, OCSD Asset Management, in collaboration with Operations and Maintenance, presented the project to our management clearinghouse for approval to proceed with procurement.
Okay. When did the first bid come in? You mentioned that. You reiterated what someone has already testified before you. When was the first bid presented to the district?
The first bid was presented in April of 2019.
And you're saying, for what am I? It's not listed in your petition. It didn't say that it was presented April 2019 either. At least I didn't see it.
That is correct. The bidding period ends in April. When the variance petition was filed, it was filed before the official closing date of the bid.
Now I'm a little confused. The first bid that came in, you said was excessive, so you had to go out again. Give me the sequence of operations as this occurred.
Sure, it was a cursory check. So the asset manager, in collaboration with Operations and Maintenance, they have access to the procurement portal. We were able to go in and see the bids that have already electronically been submitted. So it was a cursory check before the official closure of the bid process.
So that's something you use as a guide, though, saying, let's go back out for bid again. So you're telling me there was no delay in terms of acquiring a bid response to the scope of work preparation?
The contractors responded within their allowed time.
So there's no delay, although it was suggested that it was delayed for that process during testimony.
I'm sorry, I don't understand. I don't understand where you're going with the
The
process.
point was making with Mr. Thompson that they had to resubmit the bid application because the first bid came unexpectedly very high. He didn't say that electronically we observed this, came in very high. That was the first response.
Correct.
Therefore, I was left with the impression that they had to resubmit the bid application.
That is correct. So once the bid process officially closed, we were left with only that one bidder that we had already seen when he uploaded his bid. So that is correct what Mr. Thompson said.
That one bidder.
That one
Then
bidder.
what did you do subsequent to that point?
So from that point forward, asset management went back to the drawing table to refine and revise the scope of work that Mr. Thompson discussed earlier. And now we are in the process of reissuing a new bid process.
Revise the scope of work. In what way was it revised?
So Mr. Riaz can talk a lot more intelligently about the details.
I know, and I'm getting more confused because it's going to be kind of, testimony is going to be somewhat disjointed. Okay. Item number 14, a petition. Let's explain why it's beyond your reasonable control. that you didn't comply with the rules and permits condition provided specific evidence. When you read the last paragraph in that response, you're saying the internal process for evaluation, that was beyond your control? That should have been, that's part of the system's operation. You have the approval of approving a project, was that beyond your control?
It was presented to the OCSD clearinghouse, that is outside the bid, so we can proceed with the bid. We have to go through the administrative process and go through the OCSD clearinghouse. And so, yes, that was all part of the overall project.
That's internal.
That's all internal, correct?
Now, what about allocating the budget? That's internal. Was that beyond your control?
That is internal. What was out of control was when we went out to bid originally in March of 2019, and we got the unanticipated 9 times proposed bid. That was obviously, that was a variable that was not accounted for.
Don't you think that statement should have been included in section 14 as part of the beyond your control? But it was not.
We don't believe it was.
I know, I'm looking at it, it's not. In the scope of work writing, that you changed the scope of work, you said?
It has been revised.
I just wanted to draw, Senator, your attention to the fact that this petition was submitted in April, and the testimony was that the initial bid process had not yet concluded, so that's why it's not in
I
here.
understand that testimony loud and clear.
So I just want to confirm, Senator, that we are governed by a procurement ordinance process that we have to comply with.
Ordinance, who writes the
A
ordinance?
procurement, it's approved by our board.
Well, your board, that's internal.
Yeah, our board consists of external city and special district members.
See, when you use this, in my view, as a reason why it's beyond your control, and is all controlled internally, it doesn't suggest that it's beyond your control. That's,
Do you have another question, that's all?
it doesn't suggest it's beyond your control, because you control all that internal operation. So it's not on point. That is, the explanation is not on point in my view.
Understood.
And as raised to your earlier question, why couldn't you have gotten this done quicker? Why isn't that, it could be a time delay now, we would not have been 6 months ago.
And I'd like to defer the details of that to Mr. Thompson, if he were to come back up on the stand. He can speak a lot more intelligently about the details of the timelines and his departmental efforts from the date of the incident to present.
All right, we'll wait for Ms. Thompson.
Yes, Mr. Balagopalan.
Mr. Abu-Sheben, sorry. The last source test was on June 2018, and the engine went down August 17, 2018. Do you know how many hours between the time period from the last source test to when the engine was taken out of service, the engine ran?
We can definitely get you that information. I don't have it on hand right now.
And because the rule does allow some flexibility again, depending on the number of hours, you're not.
It's above the 2,000 hours.
It's above the 2,000 hours?
That is correct.
Okay. But then but less than 8,000 because it didn't run for a year, so 8760.
That is correct.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Any other questions before we move on? Yeah, and let me ask, Ms. Gross, should we be introducing Mr. Thompson, or does, Mr. Riaz, I don't.
Right, yes,
have
sorry for
additional-
that. So Mr. Thompson testified earlier about the ordinances and the prioritization and kind of the governing constraints. So if we have follow-up questions about that, we can bring him back. And Mr. Muinadeen is going to speak in more detail about the dates and things involved in the procurement process, the very specific details involved in contracting and the steps to fill in the blanks of, why does something take a certain amount of time? But in terms of the concern about something being within our control because it's internal, Mr. Thompson can come back and speak to that as the Assistant General Manager and explain again about ordinances and what governs in general the running of the OCSD.
And we do recall that he did give testimony on that earlier, but when we get to that, we'll take your next witness now, and if we have follow-up questions remaining, then we'll consider bringing Mr. Thompson back. So you may introduce your next witness.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce Riaz Muanadeen. Could you please state your name and also spell it for the record?
Yes, yes, my name is Riaz Moinadeen, spelled R-I-A-Z. Last name is spelled M-O-I-N-U-D-D-I-N.
Thank you. And have you been administered the oath today?
Yes, I have.
What is your position at OCSD?
I'm currently the maintenance manager for the treatment plants.
And what's your background?
Maintenance manager.
What is your background?
My background is I'm an engineer by education and by license in control systems. I've been within different departments of OCSD for the last 15 years. Engineering, process controls, operations, and maintenance.
Okay. Thank you. And what are your job responsibilities then at OCSD?
So I oversee the maintenance at the 2 treatment facilities that we have, one in Huntington Beach and one in Fountain Valley.
Okay, thank you.
I do not oversee the vast collection systems.
Okay.
That is under somebody else.
So are you familiar then with the processes involved in repairing or procuring services for repairs on equipment at the treatment facilities?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So with that in mind, I just would like to go into a little bit of detail about some of the timing and steps that are involved. 2 things I want to talk about. I'd like to get clarity on the timing of a repair and the likelihood that it could be complete, between April and June if the bid had come in. And I also want to talk about what the timing is like going forward. So if we could start with what, going forward with the current bid that we've heard testimony will close this week and you're expected to get bids.
So the second scope of work is currently under development. It's being reviewed with the asset engineer and the purchasing department. To my knowledge, it has not been bid out yet. I checked the portal just the other day to make sure. So it has not been advertised for bid yet, so it's still being worked out. So I anticipate the scope of work being finalized hopefully in the next couple of weeks.
Okay. And so from the time the scope of work is finalized, will this remain at the 7-pack level? We've heard testimony from Mr. Thompson that there's a standard open bid and a mid-level 7-pack and then an emergency type of level.
So our intention is to keep it at mid-level 7-pack bid process.
Okay. And what is the time period from when you receive bids in to when you select a company and then construction commences, roughly?
So rough time periods are, and the milestones are, once a scope of work is finalized and questions and answers are answered by the asset engineer and the purchasing department, it goes to review internally within OCSD for insurance requirements potentially that are bonding requirements, and also by our safety department. We have a risk management department because we have a lot of hazards within our treatment plants, confined spaces, areas where we have high concentrations of H2S and so forth. So it has to go through some kind of a review process with our risk management folks so they can understand the scope of work. And if they have questions and back and forth, we would have to answer them. And after that process has finalized, then we would work with the purchasing department to get a date to put it on our, for advertisement in our portal.
Okay, so if, it sounds like even though the contractors have 2 weeks to respond, there's quite a bit of procedure that must be followed by OCSD?
There's quite a bit of prerequisites that we have in our internal processes. That is also a part of the Ordinance 52, but it's also internal processes that's beyond the ordinance.
Okay, and by Ordinance 52, what is that?
That's the governing ordinance for all procurements at OCSD
Okay.
that we follow, that maintenance follows.
So does that mean then that by following the mid-level 7-pack, it could take some time before the construction company, you execute a contract with them because of following these mandatory prerequisites?
So the time period from when we actually bid and advertise, by the time we get back bids, that's a pretty structured time period, approximately 30 days. It has a little bit of flexibility based upon the purchasing agent at the district. But there are internal variables, prerequisites prior to bidding that we have to review and so forth that I kind of explained earlier. And then there is post-bidding reviews, that making sure that, if the contractor, for example, would be, is bound by prevailing wages, state laws, and so forth, if there's any additional licensing issues, if there's a subcontractor that the contractor is introducing, if his paperwork and his prevailing wages, and that's also reviewed by the purchasing team.
Okay, so in your view, and I should ask, have you had a chance to look at the proposed conditions and the milestone dates that are associated with the conditions?
Yes,
Okay.
briefly, yes.
And so, in your view, does the August 31st, does the first milestone in there, August 31st, 2019, to execute a contract with the construction company, is that a reasonable amount of time? Does that, even though it's
It's
more
a
than-
reasonable time, especially given our context of everything else that we have going on. So just to give you kind of an idea of all the activity at the sanitation district, the maintenance budget for the treatment plants itself is approximately, this is the discretionary portion of the maintenance budget, that doesn't include all the structured costs, is approximately $17 million. And so there's a lot of activity that occurs in maintenance. I think it was previously pointed out that we have, on the average, about 600 work orders and a week, and a lot of them require parts procurement and getting that staged up front. So there is a lot of activity that gets done that has to be queued up, and there's always a balancing act with regard to priorities, with regard to getting resources focused appropriately on the various issues that we're constantly juggling with.
Okay. And so the second milestone is the completion of construction, being November 30th. So could you explain, just looking forward, what's involved in the steps between you execute a contract and completion of construction, and if that period of time is a sufficient or reasonable time, or if it's...
So once we have gotten an award that we reviewed and we're satisfied with, we then would communicate that out to the contractor and establish a notice to proceed date, a kickoff date, so that they would come on site and they would get familiar with our, and have a meeting with our safety department. And then we scheduled, if we need to be, operations and maintenance personnel, so they would meet them out there, and if there's any other issues with fall protection, confined space, any hazards, we go and walk that down with them. So we'd have to schedule all that with our staff and get that queued up.
Okay. And again, when we're looking at the milestone timeframes, I just want to understand, so with the January 1st timeframe, that's your deadline to complete the corrective maintenance. That's something that you do after the engine is repaired, and the SCR, which is the items in the petition.
Yeah, so the contractor is going to be doing some work with regard to the emissions exhaust piping system. Internally, internal OCSD resources will be doing some work also on the engine to making sure that the blast didn't damage the internal components of the engine. So we will also be queuing up some activity there internally to making sure that the engine is healthy and so forth. And also to validate any assumptions. If you find that, there's, for example, we've lost more catalyst cells than we had anticipated, that we have enough spares in-house to accommodate that and so forth. If you find more leaks in the exhaust system than we had anticipated, that we would have to issue a change order to the contractor, review that, and things like that. Then there's also the normal process of tuning up an engine prior to starting it up after a long period of not having it running.
Okay. So it sounds like when you look at these milestone conditions that are on here, there's a practical amount of room, but is there a lot of extra room?
There is some room, but given in the context that we're juggling a lot of activity at the treatment plants.
Okay.
And we have a lot of varying priorities of work. And to be able to schedule my staff to support this, we do need a little bit of flexibility. Not everything can be tight as a snare drum. We have to have enough capacity in our system to be able to jostle. We're always challenged with break-in work. On the average, our CMs are 25%. That means the amount of resources that we have to allocate for unknown break-ins is on the order of 25%. There is so much equipment, 45,000 assets that we have to maintain within the plants, and we could never predict a failure, that this is going to fail today or that's going to fail tomorrow. We have to be, a portion of our work is reactive.
So when you are considering prioritizations and allocations, are you, and procurement, are you referring back to your governing ordinances or your mission as a public agency in terms of how you process your projects or your work orders?
Well, yes, on both I guess, both vectors, yes, absolutely. We're governed by our ordinance. We're mandated. It's an ordinance. We have to follow it. But on the practical level, we have a lot of bids going on also. So we have to make sure that we can actually execute the work. If you don't have the resources in place, and a contractor comes on board, for example, and we don't have people there to support him, he's just going to waste his time, and it'll cause a time delay on him, and that we will have to potentially pay for.
And so there are rules that OCSD must follow as you participate in the public bidding or solicit bids.
There's rules that we have to follow per the ordinance, but there's also safety requirements that we internally have, our standards that in place that we follow. We have our own communication protocols that we have to follow.
Okay. And so when we think back, and to address Ms. Prusak's question a little bit of the time, in your experience being involved in maintenance and procurement specifically, if the bid had come in April, would you have been able to complete all of this work in time, or how would you have, or might there have been a need to still delay the source test even with the bid coming in April?
I think potentially it would have been a very optimistic date that would not have taken into account potential unknowns that we could have uncovered that certainly could have pushed the emissions testing down. If you had found additional leaks, if you didn't have the bellows received in time, the parts to make the repairs, which the contractor is not ordering, and so forth, yes, there's a high, I wouldn't say high potential, but there is a potential that we would have missed the emissions testing.
Yeah. And so it sounds like filing the variance was a prudent thing, whether or not the bid had come through, because we would have potentially needed it at that point.
That's correct.
Okay. I just want to make sure. So, and your testimony just now has taken us through, up until March 2020, and we heard earlier testimony about the source testing. Would you confirm that that after the completion and the tuning, are you familiar with the source testing process and how long it takes, or is that more within Ms. Abu-Shaban's?
I'm somewhat familiar with it, but not to the extent that.
Okay, I just wanted to confirm the scope of the testimony. No further questions, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, Ms. Feldman, do you have questions for Mr. Moinudin?
No, thank you. No questions for this witness.
Ms. Byrd has a question?
I just had a little cleanup question. You mentioned that lots of bids go out. Are you saying that you're working on projects that have, are you working on several bids with projects at a time? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, there's multiple bids that
And-
have to go out, and they're in different phases of the bidding process. Some are initial scope of work, some are getting crafted, like, what do we do, what's a problem statement? Some are going to the clearinghouse to get internal approval to say that this problem exists and this is of this significance. We need your permission to go forward. Once some have passed the clearinghouse and are queued up to be a scope of work to be developed by engineers and other craftspeople that we have. And then once that's done to a certain extent, going back and forth with purchasing to make sure the language is appropriate, the dates are appropriate. And once that's done, going to risk management and so forth and insurance. So there's multiple bids that are
So
occurring
just like
simultaneously.
this bid, which has all these components that you mentioned, there are other bids at the same time that you're dealing with. And would you say then that on a weekly, monthly basis, what does that look like?
So there are different types of bids. Ones that we actually have to write purchase orders on that are technical in nature, that we might need to get a competitive bid that's not in the 7-pack.
Okay.
Ones that are beyond the 7-pack that needs a much more complicated bid document, might need some drawings or stamped by an engineer and so forth.
Okay.
So it just depends. And then we have non-stock parts. Like, for example, we might order 1,500 non-stock parts that we don't carry in the warehouse per year.
Okay. And that number, when you say 45,000 assets, we're talking about 45,000 potential places where you may have to do some repairs, replacement.
That's the number of assets that's in our CMMS database, approximately 45,000. It's always changing because there's always new stuff being added, stuff being deleted with CIP projects. And there's always $185 million worth of CIP projects that are coming in that we're spending money on, that we're receiving assets that we have to integrate into our CMMS and our new assets, and that we're decommissioning old assets. And then the balance that are there, we constantly have to evaluate, fix. And so stuff is breaking. We have hundreds, maybe 1,000 pumps within the treatment facilities, thousands of valves, actuators, I don't know, thousands of miles of pipe, different sizes, different systems. We have air systems, we have pneumatic systems, we have electrical systems, we have cabling all over the place. We have control panels, hundreds of control panels. It's a lot.
Okay. And just to confirm your statement earlier about the potential for your April to June completion, it was optimistic, and it probably wasn't
In my
likely
mind,
to
it was
happen
optimistic. I mean,
anyway.
potentially, if everything went well, we could have met the date, but there's always these bids that turn sour, and there's always constantly, there is an unknown. Just the other day, we had a bid go out for an elevator repair, for a freight elevator in one of our buildings, and the subcontractor that was hired by the 7-pack didn't perform, and so we had to end the bid after months of bickering and so forth with the contractor, and then start a new bid.
Okay. I think I got the gist of it. Thank you.
Senator Hadcock? No? Yes?
With engine number 3 being out of service, the thought of losing $1.6 million annually, wouldn't that make it an urgency?
So if we had all 4 engines run simultaneously for 1 year, we would lose approximately $1.6 million. But we only produce enough digester gas to be able to run approximately 3 engines as of now, and with some blending of natural gas. So the engines are there for multiple purposes. One is that obviously they're there essentially to treat the digester gas, and so we don't emit emissions that are in violation of our permit. But secondarily, they are also an economic benefit to the district, secondarily an economic benefit, so that it produces electricity and process heat if the engine was running. We would run the engine primarily for our treatment purposes. We would only make enough power to use internally. We don't want to make more power and burn extra natural gas and sell it to Edison for pennies on a dollar or whatever they are willing to give us for that.
If this engine 3 is out of service for a year, question, would you lose $1.6 million? Yes or no?
No.
So then it shouldn't be in the petition. On page 7,
Maybe it needs to be
second
clarified.
paragraph.
Maybe it needs to be clarified that it's potentially, if it ran, we would, yeah, it probably needs to be reworded and clarified.
Did you have an?
He didn't answer, trying to answer.
Pardon me?
I'm waiting for your answer.
I think it potentially needs to be clarified, what's in the,
We need to be, who's going to clarify that?
I would say add, if we only had 3 engines available to us, then that would be true. If you had 4 engines available, then the 4th engine would be a standby, and we would keep it not running until we lost one engine, then we would bring it on.
But you're not going to lose any money at all, no value, no $1.6 million. Even though you say in the petition you would.
I would clarify the petition to say that if you only had 3 engines available to us and the other 2 were down for maintenance or other activities, then we would lose 1.6 million if we lost.
Then it should, would you think it should be written that way in the petition? So at least I know what's going on.
It should be clarified
Yeah.
to be in that manner, yes.
You clarifying it now, is that correct?
I'm trying to clarify it now, yes.
Okay, thank you. You asked a question about the number of proposals that's going out in terms of to define or the scope of work that's required in order to submit the bid. You see there are multiple proposals going out, and finally, in the final analysis, you come up with a scope of work, is that correct? I mean, you come up with a, scope of work.
Yeah, so the final bid document is what we call the scope of work, and it could constitute a written description, or it could constitute drawings, specifications, and so forth. That is a package, a scope of work
So
package.
December 6th, you ready for the scope of work has been defined, and all these subcontractors have submitted their bid, and the clearinghouse saying, we're ready to go.
So, no, that is not correct. On December 6th, we
What
went
is
to the
it?
clearinghouse with a problem statement saying that we lost an engine because of this issue potentially. We don't know exactly at that point what the scope is to fix it. That needs to be done and researched by the asset engineer, the craftspeople, and so forth, and then go to purchasing with that document.
So the scope of work is being developed at that point in time.
Yeah, so when we go to the clearinghouse, we go to the clearinghouse, internal clearinghouse, with a problem statement saying that we have this problem at the facility, and it looks like this needs to be repaired, and potentially it could cost this much in our initial estimate, and the priority of this is this XYZ.
So the bidding process, at what point does it start?
So the bidding process officially starts when purchasing department advertises officially the scope of work to bid and puts it on our portal and starts soliciting bids and invites the contractors to, so there's an official invitation to contractors.
When was that done?
So the official issued is March 7th, 2019. March 27th, 2019.
Okay, you mentioned something about the bidders. They had to be certified or they had problems bidding I think Ms. Bird asked you a question about bidders.
So there's always some issue that might come up, that comes up, whether it's a issue with a subcontractor, whether it's a misinterpretation of the scope documents and we were not clear enough with regard to the scope documents and the contractor misinterpreted it, or there is always some issue that needs to be clarified.
Contract is misinterpreted. What do you mean by that?
If they read this document and they didn't have sufficient time to read it, they make assumptions and they'll cover their risk by increasing the cost. That's a potential problem.
If they don't respond to the terms and conditions of the contract or the proposal, wouldn't it be rejected?
So, yeah, so we have bids, not necessarily in the 7-pack, but in other bids that we always have issues with terms and conditions, and that it always slows down the process. We have to bring lawyers on board, and their lawyers and our internal lawyers to try to get to a terms and conditions that we both can agree
You
upon.
submit a lot of contracts almost daily. You have a list of qualified bidders?
We do have a list of qualified bidders. That's what the 7-pack are, but we don't know their subcontractors potentially.
So the qualified bidder is not responsible for including in the bid process subcontractors that are qualified and certified?
Their subcontractors are not on our list, so it could be a specialty subcontractor, like an elevator company that, we had a problem with an elevator we needed, and they bring a subcontractor on board, for
Do
example.
you ever rejected responding to a bid because the subcontractor was not qualified? He's saying yes.
I'm saying that we evaluate the subcontractors. I don't know on the 7-pack system if you actually rejected a bid based on a subcontractor, but we evaluate and look at.
Is that not being non-responsive?
Pardon me?
Is that not being non-responsive to the bid when you have a subcontractor that's not certified or qualified?
It could be deemed potentially as non-responsive.
Deemed non-responsive. So we're slow in getting this process underway, apparently. We're very slow, but thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Mr. Malagopalan.
Mr. Mohideen, the scope of work that you pointed out, the 3/4-inch document, so that is detailed, and I think, let me back, Mr. Thompson said maybe that was too detailed and that's why you only got one bid and it was 9 times what you expected. So are you paring it down? I mean, is the scope of work the same? I mean, and the detail that has to be done to repair the engine and the control system? What is it going to be done before you go to rebid?
So our intention is to simplify the scope of work so it's very clear and take away the appendices that might mislead the contractor into thinking that they have to do a lot more work.
So have you had a chance to look at the order, the conditions in the order?
I kind of perused it briefly, yes.
And my concern is, it says in number 1, it shall execute a contract with the construction company for repairs to address items in the petition. The items in the petition, when I look at it, and maybe it's very just refers to the engine mainly, and it looks like more, and this is on almost at the very end, job plan details. I'm assuming this is printed from your system, just a small piece of the overall project scope, is that?
So I'm not
If you look in the-
following,
Can you look at the petition and look at the very end, on the way it says job plan details?
What page?
The,
Oh, it's an
yeah.
attachment.
attachment, sorry, yeah, the attachment to the petition. Well, there were two things in the attachment. One is a service report that was done by I think it was electrical company. Let's see, who was that?
so I think I can defer that to the asset engineer, but briefly, that was our attempt to scope out the scope of work appropriately by bringing in an external expert.
Right, so this petition actually doesn't address all the things they have to do. Your scoping document does, right? So when it refers to this is like a preliminary report when they did an analysis, and when I look at this job service detail, it's just talking about the engine specifically. So it's really, I'm wondering whether this petition should refer to the scope of documents revised, issued on whatever date it is, instead of referring to this petition, because this is a very, I don't know, if this is all you're going to do, then I don't think it's going to address your problem. That's what I'm getting at.
If I could just clarify, based on my communications on the conditions, the items in the petition really is much more broad to mean the repair of the engine and the SCR, not specifically, but we can revise it.
Can we say for necessary repairs?
Yes.
And then take out to address items in the petition?
Yeah, I think that, because if I look at this, then, it's not, you're not going to solve the issue. Can I ask you, were you there when the backfire occurred?
No, I was not there.
What time of the day was it, do you happen to know when it occurred?
So
Daytime,
I think it was in the evening.
In the evening.
At nighttime. But it's a 70 or 90 acre campus.
right, but when you do the root cause analysis, you do go back to find out when it happened and, whether it was, so was that, I think, was it in a startup mode at that time when it happened, or was it up and running, or?
So we do pull trends from our historian or our SCADA system to see exactly when it shut down, when the event happened, when the pressure excursions, if you can trace it.
Right.
And I think that process we went through with the asset engineer, and I can defer that to the mechanical engineer, but since he has that information in detail. But we do have trends.
And I really don't think we need to go into the detail. I was just trying to understand. I think Mr. Thompson said that it was a startup mode, and I just wanted to, verify that it was startup mode. The RTO was not in full up and running, so it didn't burn off the excess gas,
Yeah, the trends indicate that it was in startup mode.
Yeah, okay, all right, thank you. That's all I want to know.
Okay. Any other questions that we need for the 6 findings? Okay. Do you plan to introduce any additional witnesses?
No.
Okay. Ms. Feldman, do you have any witnesses you wish to present?
Not unless the hearing board has questions.
Why don't you indicate to,
I have 2 witnesses potentially, so if you could just give me an indication of
What
the
you wanna
nature of
hear.
your questions.
I'm sorry, can you indicate what questions
Oh,
you
yeah,
wish to have?
no, I think the permit condition.
About the permit conditions.
Permit condition, because it's sort of generic, and the rule does give more flexibility, and so, I'm trying to.
Let me introduce Mr.
sure.
Gill. If you could state your name and spell it for the record.
Hello, my name is Christopher Gill, CHRISTOPHER. My last name is GILL.
Did you take the oath this morning?
Yes, I did.
And what is your position with the South Coast AQMD?
I am an air quality engineer number 2 for the waste management and toxics team.
Are you familiar with the permits that have been issued to Orange County Sanitation District?
Yes, I am.
Okay, Mr. Balakapalan.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm sorry, Mr. Gill, you took the oath today, correct?
Yes, I did.
Thank you.
And Mr. Gill, did you work on this permit? Did you issue it?
I did not issue the permit, but I worked on their Title V revision, the most recent Title V revision permit for the facility. So I have looked at the conditions.
Okay. And let me specifically refer you to condition number 15 then of the engine permit. Let me see if I can pull it up. So 15 has specific timeframes when they're supposed to do the source test. Now, Rule 1110.2, as Ms. Abu Shaban pointed out, F1C gives somewhat more, a different, I mean, it's the same, it's addressing the same rule, am I right? 1110.2?
Yes, it is.
And there's flexibility in the rule that if the engine is down for more than 3 months, they can delay the source test.
Correct.
So would they still be in violation of this permit condition? Because I don't see a specific date, it just says startup and annually, so there's no, but then it does refer to the requirement, shall be conducted in accordance with 1110.2 requirements.
That's really more of a legal question. Once you have an annual requirement in your permit, it is in fact annual, no matter what the rule may say. The permit condition will control because it's specific to that facility. And I believe we've had testimony from Petitioner that they did submit applications to have that changed so that the flexibility could be incorporated into the permit.
And that's what I was getting to. So what is it, the change that what specifically they submit and what change are you proposing to make to
Well, it's a change that they requested that is currently being evaluated.
evaluate? So it's not, okay.
It hasn't been issued yet.
But I'm assuming that the change they're requesting is the flexibility that is provided in the rule, is that?
Correct.
So that there's no, so that in the event something like that occur, they will not be in violation of the permit condition?
Yes, yes.
And that is for all the 5 engines there, basically?
Yes, and the SCRs too.
And the ACRs too?
Because on the SCRs, it has the 1 year
annual,
for the ammonia slope.
Okay,
testing.
all right, that's all I wanted to know, thank you.
I had one question, and I wonder if Mr. Gill is the correct person to answer it. My only question was just generally speaking, whether AQMD staff is concerned at all about the timeline that is presented in the proposed conditions in terms of it going through the winter months where perhaps 4 engines might be required at any given time.
I can't answer that.
Okay.
Yeah.
No? Okay. Any other questions? And I should ask Ms. Gross if you had any questions on the testimony.
No questions, thank you.
Any others before I close? Because you have no other witnesses, correct, Ms. Feldman?
No other witnesses.
Okay, before we close the hearing, any other questions? Okay, I'm going to close the hearing, and I'm going to ask if there's any member of the public who wishes to be heard. And I see none. Ms. Gross, you are closing.
Thank you. Thank you for your time today. I believe that the testimony that you've heard is sufficient to set forth the evidence required to make the 6 findings. You've heard that there is an imminent permit violation because they will not be able to source test by the June 7th, 2019 deadline. Importantly, most of the testimony was dedicated to explaining why the OCSD is experiencing circumstances beyond their reasonable control such that requiring compliance with this permit condition would impose an unreasonable burden upon the essential public service that the agency provides, including sewage treatment. OCSD, you've heard testimony, has a lot of projects and a lot of equipment going on at any given time. They serve 2.6 million people. They have an incredibly sophisticated wastewater treatment system, and they are governed as a public agency by their own governing ordinances and a board that adopts those ordinances. So although it appears that they're running themselves, that's not necessarily the case. As you know, public agencies often are less flexible in terms of the adjustments that they can make internally when trying to turn their attention to various projects. They have rules specified in the ordinances on what can constitute an emergency or a mid-level priority, and they have procurement rules that they must follow in terms of bidding, having bidding open to the public. They're spending public tax dollars, and they have a mission as a public agency to efficiently use their resources to achieve safe and efficient wastewater treatment while complying with other applicable laws. And so given that they're very complex, they have a lot that they're constantly juggling. Things are constantly changing. And they have acted diligently, you heard testimony, with their attention to the delay in the source testing despite all of these competing requirements. And you've heard that things can change over time. They have built in flexibility with the 5 engines necessary that are providing backup power and that circulate. So you heard testimony that they rotate the engines in order to provide the necessary power and electricity, and they have devoted quite a bit of attention to this permit condition compliance and are proceeding appropriately with streamlining it to the 7-pack level rather than putting it open for bid. And so it's been elevated through the process. They followed the variance petition procedures prudently, because even if everything had gone according to plan, which we've heard testimony sounds incredibly optimistic, if not potentially unlikely, there would have been a strong possibility of needing to delay the source testing anyway. And so they did file the petition in April when it was clear that they were going to be running up against that deadline no matter what. The timeline that they've laid out is practical and takes into considerations the many, many, many variables that they are constantly dealing with on a daily basis. And to not grant the variance, I think you've heard testimony, would be burdensome, not only from a monetary standpoint, but primarily from their own project management standpoint. Their ability to process their 600 work orders through their clearinghouse, their ability to turn their attention to things that are a higher priority in terms of providing the essential public service. So that is where the hardship would come in if this variance were not to be granted. You've heard that OCSD has considered curtailment, and indeed they are operating with the standby engine shut down for a period of about 21, 22 months. But this cannot be a permanent solution to complying with the permit condition in any way. They can't give up that engine because, as you've heard, they need to be able to bring engines on standby, especially if one of them is out of commission for a repair. There are no excess emissions expected through this variance period, and there have been no excess emissions to date. The conditions provide that when the engines are ready to start up, the startup will be within the parameters of the applicable rules and permit conditions. And OCSD will continue to conduct any monitoring and reporting that they're already required to do. The other engines that are operating are each hooked up to their own SCR, as you heard, and are compliant with their own permits. While it is some amount of time, it's not excessive, and OCSD believes that by committing to these milestones, which are essentially increments of progress, they will make forward progress towards compliance, and depending on the parallel track of their permit modification application, it may be that they will not need the variance coverage sooner than May 15th, 2020, but it remains to be seen because that is also not within their control. So I believe that the findings can be made, and we appreciate your time and consideration of the testimony.
Thank you, Ms. Pellman. Your closing.
Yes, thank you. The district agrees that the petitioner has presented adequate evidence to support the 6 findings necessary for the granting of a variance. I think the only rubbing point in this case was the compliance schedule, is the compliance schedule. And so I think the issue before you is really just that. It's singular. It's how much flexibility is appropriate to grant to this petitioner in order to get into final compliance. And we have 2 competing interests here. We have an engine that is not operating and will not be operated until the very end of the variance period when it will need to be brought back online. There are no excess emissions associated with this variance. The operation of this engine is not necessary to this petitioner, and in that regard, we have to defer to their expertise. They said they don't have to operate it now. They don't anticipate that they can't get around the need for this engine even during the winter months. I will defer to their good judgment. So you take that in sum and you say, well, it's a very generous compliance schedule. There's a lot of cushion built into it. So it has no adverse impact on the environment. They have permit applications pending. There's nothing really dictating against the granting of a variance until May of next year. On the other hand, the hearing board has a very clear directive that variances must be crafted so that the petitioner achieves final compliance as expeditiously as possible. And in looking at this, you may be tempted to say, well, I don't know if this is as expeditious as possible because of all the time built into each step. And in that regard, I am leaning towards the petitioners. This is a very complex system we're talking about. They've already encountered problems, unanticipated problems, with the bidding process and realizing what was necessary in order to effect repairs, let alone select a contractor. So they've crafted a compliance schedule that anticipates things going wrong in future. And because it doesn't have any adverse impact on the environment, and according to their testimony, has no adverse impact on their operations and the essential public service that they provide, the district is willing to maintain its non-opposition position on this variance.
Thank you. Board members? Mr. Balagopalan, you wanted to begin?
Yeah, I'll take, I think we can find, make the 6 findings to give the variance. You know, I think it's, they had a backfire on the engine that caused the engine to be taken out of service. They went for bidding, but they got a high bid, which had a rethink of going back. They can rebid it to maybe get a more costs, which is within their budget. So I think they've taken the steps that necessary to rectify the situation. Their engine is out of service, as Mr. Feldman said, and the petitioner said that there's no excess emission during this period. The engine is out of service, and even though it's not reflected in the permit, the rule sort of actually says if it's more than 3 months, they have some time to bring it back, and when they can do the test. So, and the other thing is this is these engines have, and the last test showed very low numbers showing compliance of 1110.2. So that's, you know, so it has demonstrated that it can meet once it's back in operation with the 1110.2 limits, and I've got to ask if the other engines met those limits, but I'm assuming they did. And so I think it's they're in violation of the permit condition that says they must test it annually. I'll leave it at that. You know, and I think it's beyond the reasonable control. They couldn't. They didn't anticipate that happening. I think it's due to the changes to the jet cells in the system when they replaced it last year. That I think their root cause analysis determined that was probably the reason why there was the backfire and the damage. So it looks like there's extensive, I mean, not I won't say use the word, there's damage both to the control system and maybe potentially crackheads or something in the engine which they have to look at and repair. So they do need some time, and I think, and as the petitioner pointed out, they have 4 other engines running. This is rotating, but in the event something else happened and this is a treatment plan, they may have to shift priorities real quickly to something else because they can sort of give it a lower priority if something else happens, something catastrophically fails at the plant to do. So I think so I think the timeline that they have built in as a factor to give them more. While it's long, I think it's for a public agency, it's probably appropriate with the limited resources and other competing parties that may occur. As Mr. Mohideen pointed out, there are 14,000 different things that could go wrong, and some things could be more critical than something that's already offline and not doesn't have to be brought on right away if they have to shift resources. So I think we can, for that reason, I think, they're already out of, there's no excess emissions, so there's nothing to monitor this time. And so I think we can make the 6 findings, quite easily in this case.
Thank you. I do agree after hearing all the evidence and the arguments that we can make the 6 findings. I think I had issues with the timeline, both with the beyond reasonable control finding and also just how long the variance is proposed to be in place before final completion and final compliance. So I'll start with, I guess, my thoughts on beyond reasonable control, because aside from the backfire itself, that I do believe to be beyond their reasonable control, I don't think it was anticipated. The last backfire was in the 90s, I think that was the testimony, and it had to do with the gas not being treated, and that has all changed. So I don't think it was anticipated, and I do believe it was beyond the reasonable control. But beyond the reasonable control goes beyond that. It means that beyond reasonable control, that to require compliance now and to avoid any kind of unreasonable taking of property. And that also is dependent upon the timeline from when this occurred till June, when testing would have had to have been completed. But I do believe we have sufficient testimony. This is a public agency, and we are required, just to backtrack for a minute, under Health and Safety Code 2352.5 to consider the timely and reasonable steps taken also to seek a variance. But I do think there was sufficient testimony that they are under this ordinance and that it would not have qualified as an emergency, that would have been quicker, that they did do it in the mid-level 7-pack process. And it seems that it did move up until the time of bidding in accordance with that process, and something went wrong in the bidding. And even if they had determined earlier than April that they might need a variance, there's nothing we could have done to quicken the process, because I think the bidding process had to be completed according to the ordinance and the requirements that they're under. So I don't think we would have been here any quicker, or at least we couldn't have made things happen any quicker. And they filed in April. So I do believe I can find beyond reasonable control. And I do agree that I did have concerns when I hear 4 engines might be needed in the winter, and if something went wrong, diesel engines might be used. But it sounds to me that that is a remote consideration. And in particular, when we have testimony with regard to the fact that any of these engines being down for any reason is pretty rare. And so I know they're getting old. They are definitely showing wear and tear. That was also the testimony. But I'm going to defer, as Ms. Feldman is doing as well, to their better judgment and flexibility. So I can make the findings. Ms. Byrd.
I would agree that I could definitely make the findings. This is a public agency, and one thing that we don't want is to, I would imagine that the requirements from the Water Quality Board are such that we want to make sure nothing ever happens, you know, and so while the engines, while the 4 engines may be sufficient to keep things going without enormous concern, I think that we just have to err on the side of caution to make sure that the sewage treatment plant is always available. It's not something you can stop. Whatever's flowing in is going to come in whether the engines are working or not. So, so I think that I can definitely make the findings. Also, I think that recognizing all of the items that are being juggled in the air, I'm going to defer to this agency as to their understanding of how to manage that, because 45,000 assets, you know, different bids coming and going and all that, I'm sure that that is difficult and has to be prioritized. And so I'm going to defer to the agency, and I think we can make the findings. I think we should issue this variance based on those findings.
I should just add really quickly, because we did not cover, I think, 2 of the findings really appropriately enough, and that is, what is the taking of property? Well, if we were to insist upon compliance, the answer would be they would not be able to comply because the engine is out of service and can't be tested. And as a result, they would be subject to fines that could become very substantial over this time period. And when you consider that it is an essential public service, that would be an unreasonable burden upon that public service. And then just to tie it up, that closing or taking would be without a corresponding benefit in reducing air contaminants, since there are no excess emissions. And I'm sorry, Senator, you had some discussion you wanted to add as well.
Yes, I will support the findings also. And the reason why is because you're serving an area of 2.5 million people. The amount of wastewater is about 70 million gallons per day. To avoid polluting the nearby waterway, to me, that's essential. The federal government recognizes it also. That's why the EPA came out and say, let's use engine number 3, efficient. However, your approach, based on what I've learned, to resolving the fix to the problem is almost like slow and no-go. Slow and no-go. You didn't define this to be an urgency until November. But what I know, the service that it provides for that district is the urgency from the day 1, August 17. That's your attitude. And November. Now, the clearinghouse that put together the scope of work for the bids, that was approved for bidding, as I said earlier on, December the 6th. It says it right here. The project clearinghouse approved the repairs. All been submitted. Read it. I'm reading what you gave me. December the 6th. Therefore, and it was ready for bids. Testimony saying, yes, that may be true, but there's another way we looked at bids, and it wasn't until March 7th that we sent it out for bids. Then why would you write here then December 6th, it was ready to go out to bids? And why did you have to delay? And the other this testimony was that, well, when the bids come in, they may not be qualified. Therefore, you reject them on its face. You talked about you get to deal with their attorney and your attorney. You don't. You know what the process is. When the bids are rejected, you take the lowest responsible bidder. The lowest responsive. They're responding to the bid and responsible. That means that they're qualified, certified bidders. And you know that. You're in the business. And so, knowing what I know and I see what your approach is, I'm not very happy with your approach. I'm not satisfied you got off the dime right away to get these things, problems solved, given that the federal government is saying we want that system in operation. It's in rotation when everything's working perfectly. When it's out of service, you only got 3 plants operating. What if one should fail? Then you don't have a backup. And you knew that. So at some point in time, you say, this is an urgency. Come on. It was an urgency from the day one, based on what the requirements in terms of performance for this engine. I'm going to vote for it because the government requires it, the district supports it. But I got to tell you, I'm not satisfied with the way you present it to us or the action that you take it to solve the problem.
I just wanted to, since we're in discussion, I just wanted to clarify one thing, which was the December 6th date. It states clearly in the petition that while the repairs were approved, it also goes on to state this formal approval started the process for scope of work development, and that was the testimony that we received, and that scope of work was finalized and the bidding went out in March. Whether you think that's quick enough or not, I'm not going to quibble with that. I just wanted to clarify that one statement.
It says in December 6th, the clearinghouse approved repairs. Mm-hmm. So it approved.
The next sentence says, this formal approval starts the process for scope of work development.
Scope of work.
That's right.
And the scope of work didn't start until March 7th, you're saying? It took 3 months?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying I'm not going to quibble whether or not you personally believe that that's quick enough. It's up to each member of the board to determine whether, based upon the evidence that there are 45,000 different units and a lot of balancing that goes into prioritizing and reprioritizing both preventative and actual maintenance needs, whether that was too short or quick enough. But so that's why I'm saying I'm not going to quibble with you on that. That is your opinion. But I just wanted to put that in the record. Any other discussion before we make a motion? Would you like to make a motion, or Mr. Malagoba, or I can? Okay.
I
Sure.
probably need help with the condition there, too.
And also the, if you make it for the term, perhaps just not to start until they're out of compliance on June 7th, and then to go through
So, yeah.
May 15th or until final compliance, I think, whichever occurs first.
Yeah. Okay. In the matter of Orange County Sanitation District case number 2048-14, I move that we grant a regular variance commencing June 7th and continuing through May 15, 2020, or earlier if compliance is achieved, from permit condition number 11 for the, let me pull that up. Permit condition number 11 for the air pollution control system, permit number G43807, and permit condition number 15 for the internal combustion engine, permit number G43799. This equipment is located at 22212 Broker Street in Fountain Valley, California. And let's see. The condition of the variance will be as set forth in the proposed variance condition Exhibit A with some changes. I'm going to propose something. I mean, see, I think you should probably read. Maybe I'm reading too much. Petitioner shall by August 31st, 2019, execute a contract with the selected construction company based on the scope of works and conduct necessary repairs on the internal combustion engine and so forth. And So where it says, where address items in the petition, rather refer to the scope of works that have been submitted and for the bid.
So it would read, execute a contract with the selected construction company for the necessary repairs to the internal combustion engine, et cetera, et cetera.
Based on the scope of works
sorry.
and the, based on the scope of work.
Execute a contract with the selected construction company based on the scope of work
In the bid document.
in the bid document. For the necessary
For the necessary
repairs
repairs
to the internal
to
combustion engine. Before we move forward in your motion, I just want to make sure that that is okay with Ms. Gross
Yes.
and with Ms.
Yes.
Feldman. Okay, you may continue.
Okay, and item number 2, the same language basically, where it says complete construction necessary to address necessary items in the petition, the same language that we had in 1, just to be consistent.
So can you read that as it would read?
Okay, petitioner shall by November 30, 2019, complete, this is complete construction as identified in the scope of works and to,
What if we just said a complete construction identified in condition number 1? I don't know if that makes it, or do you want to spell it out again?
no, I think there's a, 1 would be fine, I think that address the scope of works and the bid document that they submitted out to get, to select a contractor, basically.
So petitioner shall by November 30th, 2019, complete construction identified in condition number 1 to the internal combustion engine
And the air pollution control system that's listed.
and air, right, just from there.
From
forward.
there, it'll be the same, yeah.
And is that acceptable?
Number 8.
Wait 1 second, let me just, sorry.
Yeah.
Ms. Feldman, okay, go on.
Sorry. Number 8, since I don't know whether we should take it out since there's no excess emission during this period, or
Are there any fees outstanding, Madam Clerk? Okay, so we could take that out, yes?
take that out, yeah. Yes, that's all I had.
And that completes your motion?
Yes, that,
I will second that motion, and excess emissions are expected to be 0, correct? Okay. Any discussion on the motion? Senator?
I think it's a good motion that, and after each operation, I shall, and they finalize the shall and complete it, they notify the district. That's important. That's accountability. So that's the extent of the motion as well.
That's good to point out, thank you. Any other discussion on the motion? Senator, how do you vote?
Aye.
Ms. Byrd, how do you vote?
Yes.
I vote yes. Mr. Balagopalan?
yes.
Motion passes 4-0. Thank you all very much, and good luck. Any other business board members? Seeing none, we are adjourned.